Hello, everyone, and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. I am your host, Nick Henning, and we are here for the fourth of our winter break back into Frosthaven, where I four-handed played these characters to my side over here to test them out so I could make some comments on how I think each of these classes run. And in this instance, I saved Deathwalker, one of the starting classes, for last. And you know, in a lot of ways for me, I kind of saved the worst for last. More on that in a moment. So let me be clear that I actually really like that the Deathwalker exists. First of all, Valrath and Quattrell did a little dirty in Frosthaven, and I'm glad the Valrath are here being represented by a thematically very, very cool class. For any of you that did play the Forgotten Circles expansion, they clearly kind of took some concepts from that Diviner class, the kind of dropping these shadow tokens, which are, I don't remember what the Diviner called them, but essentially having these little overlay tiles on the board that don't really exist. They kind of just are there for you to interact with, and put it onto a class with a nice, a very good, I would say, like Haven game theme that kind of leans into sort of the like little dark, edgy, arcane kind of character. And certainly this class gives off mage vibes with its sort of like 6, 7, 8 hit point progression, almost kind of necromancery, except for we've got the bone shaper, so doesn't really have the necromancer side. Obviously we're very much on the shadow side. There's some specific rules here about targeting with our shadows, but frankly what it really comes down to is this component with shadows. This class runs on shadows, and the reason that this is actually was my least favorite of the classes that I played in this forerun wasn't because of the fact that it was unfun, that the cards were unfair, or anything like that. It's that this class was very feast or famine, depending on those shadow tokens. I found that what really mattered with this class was whether your shadow tokens were available to you and how they were available to you greatly impacted the power of this class, to the point that you felt like you were basically just sort of like a move to attack 2 kind of class if you didn't have your shadow tokens set up and play appropriately, to where you were just doing absolutely monster wallops when you did have shadow tokens up. Now, as a concept, I don't think that's a problem. Like the idea that you ramp up over time, you have to do a little bit of shadow token management, I don't think is an issue. My problem with the Deathwalker in this game came in some scenarios that I played, and I'll give an example from what was really just kind of the most egregious to me. I played in a scenario that was 2 rooms from the setup. It was very clear it was only going to be 2 rooms, and I started off by dumping a bunch of shadows into play at the beginning, thinking that it'd be really easy to move them into the next room. And when we moved into the next room, the surprise text of the next room was just delete the last tile, slide all characters forward into the next room, but no comments about anything like shadow tokens or overlays. So I read that rules wise that they all just went away. And so this class went from, I took my turns to set up, and then suddenly I was punished by the way that the scenario was set up. Other scenarios are maybe not going to be as brutal as this, but there are scenarios where you're kind of like teleporting in between rooms, and it's not entirely effective for you to really be playing this class in those situations. On the other hand, in rooms where you were doing more of the like, you know, there's a bunch of like King of the Hill scenarios in Frosthaven, and again, I really like the scenario designs in Frosthaven, but this class felt insanely powerful in those King of the Hill scenarios where you kind of were centralized in one location, had to survive for a number of rounds because it took you a few rounds to set up, but then you were just by far the strongest character in play. And I didn't enjoy that feast or famine style of play. Sure, it's really fun when you're kind of being really big and powerful, but the number of scenarios where I felt like this class was just far weaker than the rest of them, and not really for any like fault of its own, was a bit frustrating to me. The thing that's really neat about this class is that it is an aggressive class. Ooh. Sorry about that, light being stubborn. It's a really aggressive class. It has a high rating on melee and ranged. I primarily played this class as a ranged class, just to kind of round out the party that I had built. But after playing a little bit, honestly, I think the melee build seems like the most fun. There is a strong melee build companion guide that you can find online, but the reality is that actually you don't need to choose ranged or melee. And actually, when I was playing this class at its finest, I was switching in between doing ranged and melee type attacks based on what was needed in the scenario, and also based on what my allies, cough cough, banner spear, were doing in any given moment, which I thought was pretty neat. I do think there's something on here that's a blatant lie, though. They have mobility rated as kind of a middling part of this class, and I think mobility on this class was a really big struggle for me. Your shadows can move through bottom actions on your cards, but when you're moving your shadows, you're not moving yourself, and so transitioning from room to room was by far harder in this class than I think any other class I've played, except for maybe summons-based classes where you don't have as much control over your summons. But they did actually change the rules around summons a little bit in Frosthaven compared to the original Haven game, so they're even better than they used to be. But why don't we go ahead and get into the cards to see what exactly it is that we're talking about. So these category cards are going to be your shadow generation cards at level 1, and they're absolutely essential because you'll notice that everything in the kit cares about shadows, to the point that I do actually wonder from a design perspective if just making this top ability a core ability of the class, and making it a 10 card class instead of an 11 card class was a consideration sometime during the design process. I have to imagine that it actually was. They wanted to give people some options maybe in how to open up. But this top, I would say, is sort of the default structure of the class. If you play D&D, this is like your sort of hexing ability or hunter's mark ability, where essentially, you put this into play at the beginning. Like I said, it's an 11 card class, but I kind of think of it like almost drifter like, where you have to play this or the other card at the beginning, I think, in order to have a good time. And this one essentially says, hey, when you hit somebody, the next time that person dies, if you haven't kind of marked someone else for death, they're going to turn into a shadow, which is going to allow you to start doing some nonsense in the future. Ideally, what you want to do is attack an enemy in the midst of your other enemies. That way, when they die, your shadow is in contact with as many different folks as possible. And this persists throughout the scenario. This kind of, I've touched you, therefore you are marked for death by me. And it also works for your summons, which is nice. And then, if your summon manages to essentially kill somebody, you can turn them into a shadow, because the summons in this class are actually pretty respectable, I think. And then you get to go and sort of, you can kind of override if you want to mark someone else that your allies are going to go after if your dumb summon hasn't accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. Call to the Abyss is a card that most of the time I think you're going to be playing right at the beginning of the scenario, but I'll say that a lot of times I ended up playing this second card that's going to come right after this, and then I would actually maybe play Call to the Abyss kind of on the second cycle throughout the scenario. Part of that is at the bottom of this card also generates shadows. The problem is it just does it only once per, rest cycle, right? Using a bottom ability to put a shadow somewhere within 2, lots of flexibility. So this card is demanding in that you want to play the top and you want to play the bottom. In fact, if you could play the bottom more often, you would be happy to do so. It's just that you can only play this card, every once in a while. So managing when you have access to this card is a big deal, I think, and a big structure in how you choose to play this class. The other way that you generate shadow at the beginning is by playing Eclipse. And when I first read this, I was like, a lost card where you generate 3 shadows that are only going to essentially work in the first room that you're in. This seems like it sucks. And I underestimated it, because having a pile of shadows in play is just so important that in many scenarios in Frosthaven, you start on the back foot. Throwing 3 shadows down right at the beginning and then going crazy on turns 2, 3, and 4 actually is a very viable way to play with this class. So, if you watch my videos, you know that I tend to grind out and generate value over time. This is a class where I found myself playing this card, Eclipse, on the first turn of the scenario way more than I would have ever expected upon looking at the class. And if you're playing this class and struggling, in the beginning of the scenario, I'd recommend just giving it a shot. Like, try to go really quick on the shadows and see how it goes. On the other hand, it does suck to lose your move 4 at the bottom of this card. No matter what, though, I think this card has to come with you into the scenario. If you're using it for the move 4s and then you drop those 3 shadows in the last room, that's great too. So it does unfortunately kind of suck to have a turn where you're not really doing something, but we're going to see what those payoffs look like in just a second. I've grouped your payoff cards into two main structures, like kind of quantity and quality. These are the quantity ones. They pay off based on the number of things you have. The more shadows, the more impact. And the top of this card is pretty straightforward. It's a big hit based on the number of shadows that you have. Now, the most shadows you can have on in play is 5, but they don't care where they are. So actually, this card you can use if your shadows are left in the original room of all the ghosts that you've killed from Christmas past, or so on and so forth. And it's an attack 6 if you have all of them in play. That happens a fair amount of time by the time you get later on in the scenario, and Strength of the Abyss is a nasty card. I think it's the primary payoff, I would say, at level 1 when you're playing this class. It's very serious business. You do have to be in melee to do it, but it's well worth jumping in, walloping someone for 6, probably killing them, and then getting out of there after that. The bottom part of this card is really fun too. I didn't do it a whole lot, but if you want to play like a proper D&D style warlock and you start your first turn with Call to the Abyss and then the bottom of this other card, essentially your goal is to just kill people, and every time they turn into a shadow, you gobble up their shadows for additional attacks to make it easier to kill additional people and sort of like slide on forward. This is really great for your how do I say this, like samurai style or like Western style scenarios where bad guys just kind of keep coming at you. You're moving down a hall, you have to be going somewhere, but it's going to be kind of like a March 2, March 3, March 4 every turn. So take a look at your scenarios and see if it's the kind of one where it's like you're going to go from room to room to room to room, fighting people. The ones that are going to be where you're doing that most often are where they have consecutive small rooms because there's not a lot of space to move in between, but you're going to be kind of killing people as you trudge forward throughout these scenarios. And it's a fun way to play the game, but I did lean on mostly doing the top of Strength of the Abyss just because hitting someone for 6 with a level 1 card is pretty nasty. Anger of the Dead, hey, everybody needs a Pierce card in Frosthaven. That's a part of the design metric, clearly. And this one allows you to cash out some number of shadows. They do need to be close by in this scenario so that you could shoot someone for a whole bunch of damage. The more shadows you eat, the farther you can shoot. You get a little bit of pierce, you get extra damage if you shoot them. This is a big gnarly hit, and the bottom of this card is actually pretty nice too. Not to mention this card's initiative of 14 is generally going to let you go faster than most enemies, but if you have enemies that are standing on these shadows or going to walk into shadow hexes that turn, throwing a couple extra wounds on bad guys for free basically, especially if you're doing a different range attack, nice option on this card. I use both sides of this card plenty of times. Because of its initiative, I took it with me in basically every scenario for quite a long time. And while it seems like your enemies aren't going to walk over those shadow hexes, the shadow hexes don't operate like traps or hazards or anything like that. So keep in mind that if an enemy has an equal choice between two options and one has a shadow and one doesn't, they're just dumb AI. You can make them walk over whatever you want. So you can trigger the bottom part of Anger of the Dead more than you probably think you can. Rest in the Shade, ignore this +1 here, is going to be as good as your party decides you need healing. The more shadows there are, the more allies that can be healed, and this does require you to coordinate with your allies to be on those shadows themselves, which is not unreasonable. Maybe they just stab someone and step forward onto their body to pick up the loot anyway, so it's not out of the realm of reason that you can throw out upwards of 6 or 8 healing on this card pretty easy. The bottom of this, move all shadows up to 6 hexes, is nice. You need that in some scenarios, but it's a pretty painful loss card. It's kind of like, frankly, a comparison to Eclipse, a loss to put 3 shadows in play, but really it's more like I'm later in the scenario, my shadows are behind me, and I'm going to kind of pull them up. So it is worthwhile in the right situations, but it's really more of a consequence of playing the class. It doesn't feel exciting to do, but sometimes you just gotta to continue rolling forward with what you're doing. Wave of Anguish here is the last of our quantity cards, and it's also a lost card. This allows you to just turn all of your shadows into like a little horrible, again, D&D reference, Hunger of Hadar or whatever, Arms of Hadar. Reach out of all these shadows and attack the people that are next to them. Thematically very cool. In practice, I think as a lost card, I'm not a huge fan because you need to have many shadows that are next to many enemies. And usually what happens is you kind of like are rolling where like a couple of them are next to enemies, and it doesn't end up doing. There are fewer scenarios where the top of this card works in the way that you really want it to. That being said, you're probably taking this card with you for a bit because the bottom of the move 2 and move all shadows up to 1 hex actually does allow you to continue rolling forward. It's not a ton of mobility, but it lets you roll forward in a room where you haven't finished killing all the enemies, but they're not necessarily stacked on top of each other. A room where maybe there's a mix of melee and ranged bad guys. You're going to have situations where this wave of anguish movement and your whole army movement, your army being your shadows, just gives you the flexibility that you need to keep rolling. These last cards are this huge group of cards is the quality group, meaning just, we don't like that. Shadow Beast was messing with the green screen. They are not necessarily care. They just care that there is. Maybe binary rather than quality. They care that there is a shadow, not necessarily that there are many shadows. And we're starting off with a pretty cool one. So Shadow Beast eats a shadow from adjacent to you. So you have to, expend it, and summons this reusable summon, right? This is not a lost card. It lasts until you want it to go away, which might be when you rest, or it might just kind of keep going. And this thing moves fast, packs a huge wallop, and then takes a hit and dies maybe. But its initiative is one that goes very well with summoning a creature. So there's a good chance that you can use the top of this card to summon a shadow. It's going to go in for an attack 3 and then take a hit from an enemy. That's an extremely reasonable use for a top card, and a reasonable way to consume a shadow as you're moving forward in rooms past bodies of enemies that you've destroyed. I think Sunless Apparition is pretty good. I didn't end up playing it quite as much in the 4-player game. Things just got a little bit crowded, a little bit messy, and minions, they can be a little bit annoying in those situations. But every time it was good to play, it was very good to play for a level 1 card. And I think in a lower player counts, this probably just helps even more, honestly. The bottom of this card, you know me, I'm so on loot abilities, and the ability to teleport to a hex with a shadow is a little funky because a lot of times the shadows aren't in the most ideal situations where you want to be. Sort of the most common situations where it's good is where you've killed an enemy that's like, you have 2 enemies that are in melee with your friend, and you kill one of them, they turn into a shadow thanks to your Call to the Abyss, and then you teleport to that spot to make a big melee attack against them. But I would say most of the time I played the top of this card instead. Lingering Rot here is a card that there's a lost card that cares about where you are, and again, kind of like that little Arms of Hadar thing that we attack out of the shadow and a bunch of people get poisoned and do a little bit of an attack. Whatever. This card I played mostly for the bottom. Move 3 and poison enemy next to you is just a totally fine mid-range value card. That's the kind of card that I like to play in this game, but I don't think it's the most exciting. You're not going to be playing it forever, so I'm not going to be talking about it for too long. Fluid Knight here is pretty cool. This is sort of like the Strength of the Abyss, that big 6 attack. This is a 5 attack. It does require that you lose a shadow, and that shadow then goes away, and your enemy needs to be next to the shadow. So a fair number of conditions that are required here for that to go off. That being said, you're going to be able to trigger it at least sometime, which is pretty nice. And the bottom of this card is the thing that I think makes the melee build of this class, aside from one of the perk benefits, pretty viable. The fact that you can take a hit and then teleport to a shadow and just negate the entirety of that hit lets you set up a lot of really nice situations in this game where XYZ giant monster is about to wallop somebody, and you just stand there like, I'm the weak little mage, I can't take it. And this, repeatable card that costs you a shadow, lets you kind of get out of trouble, is a really nice way to play a cycle with this. So for example, I'd have some shadows set up, move forward, Strength of the Abyss, melee 6 attack, beginning of the next turn, play this card because I'm already in melee with some bad guys, probably go on the earlier side with my 24, and then especially if I'm, I know the kind of bad guys that I'm fighting against, and they're big behemoth, hit you with a ton of things, do another melee attack, use the bottom of this card, they hit you, you take 0 damage and teleport out of there. It's almost as good as a stun, right? You just like wasted their entire turn at the cost of a shadow on the bottom of a card. Fluid Knight is really good. Don't sleep on this ability at all. Shadow Step, on the other hand, not as good. And I thought it was going to be very good. So 19 initiative is great. And then move 3, attack 3 is very cool. The problem is that you have to move to where a shadow is. And a lot of times you don't have control exactly over where that is. You might be playing this in tandem with like, you know, a bottom that lets you move a shadow into one space. But if you're using the bottom of the card to move the shadow somewhere, it almost would have been as effective for you to move anyway. So Shadow Step ended up being more underwhelming just because of the way that you needed to set it up, or, you know, that it wasn't reliable enough, and an attack 3 is not exciting enough for me to want to be using this as often. The bottom of this card, a move 6 lost card, which drops 1 shadow on the way, that's a lost card that I really need to be moving 6, and it's probably right at the end of the scenario if I'm doing this. It doesn't even give me experience points for a lost card, which just feels like insult to injury. So Shadow Step I thought was going to be amazing, but for me actually kind of underperformed. So if you know more about Shadow Step than I do, please let me know. Call of Doom, I don't tend to like these do a piddly amount of damage against a group of people kind of things. As you might have noticed, I mean, this class is a little mage class. Our best sort of like defense is against one big wallop. So the idea of me wanting to move up against a couple of different enemies and potentially take their attacks, even if I'm muddling them, I'm not super inclined to do that. Maybe if you have some mechanism where you're putting more curses into the monster deck and those muddles are going up in value for that reason, you're a little bit more likely to play this. I'm sorry, I'm saying all that stuff, and the adjacent enemies are adjacent to a shadow. It's one of these like out of those things. My mistake. It's the same issue though of like the Shadow Step, where like that needs to be where it is. So sorry for misspeaking on that one. The bottom here, 3 and make a knight is, you know, it's a role player, completely does its job. But there's not as many knight payoffs with this class as I thought. So I didn't play Call of Doom for very long, which is probably why I wasn't able to get the card right on first take. These last couple cards are sort of the other cards, which mostly actually coincide with cards that move your shadows for you. And they also coincide with cards that eat your knight production. So this might be why I think this class doesn't use knight that much, is because I ended up using the bottoms a lot to move my shadows into positions where I wanted them to be. But the top here is a pretty basic melee attack that's a little bit better if you have knight. Sure, whatever. And the bottom lets you move all of your shadows up to 2 hexes, which was generally pretty important for me. This card lets you attack a couple people. This is actually a pretty nice attack if you do have knight, because this is 2 attack 3s in the right situation. Range 2 is not very far, but when you have a couple tanks in your group, it's not as hard to stand behind them and shoot. So Forceful Spirits for me was a decent, I don't have my shadows quite set up yet, I want to shoot a couple people system for getting some damage out there and being helpful. And then the teleporting to a hex where a shadow is, it kind of depends on the situation. There are some scenarios where this ability is absolutely busted because it lets you essentially cheat the scenario anywhere where you have to like run back and forth and things like that. This card in some scenarios is it's just insane. Like it can win the scenario for you functionally, but a lot of the time and in most scenarios, it ends up being just a mediocre move that doesn't really get you any farther than any other normal move would. Dark Fog here is a kind of lost card that I like. It's a nice attack that I'm probably only going to trigger if I can hit all 3 people, maybe if I can hit 2 people. Bottom of it lets you slingshot a shadow. This is, I think, actually better than most of the ones that move your shadows, like all your shadows 1 or 2 spaces, because when you need to be moving your shadows, usually you want to be moving them a lot of spaces. This is the only shadow card without a loss that helps you transition your shadows from one room into another. So at level 2, I took Deepening Despair, and it was okay, but I think I would push you more towards Restless Spirits. Let's talk about Deepening Despair to start off with. I wanted another card that felt like a nice payoff for putting a lot of shadows into play, but it was a real pain actually to have an enemy adjacent to 2 different shadows, and being able to attack them from infinite distance was usually not that important by the time I'd got 2 shadows down next to that person anyway. So that additional kind of infinite range perk just seemed a little weird here. I think if you're very clever and you set this up, this is very good in those like spawning scenarios, which there are a number of, and you kind of like post up in a corner, drop a bunch of shadows on that, spawn spot, and then it's easy to attack them from wherever you are. I think that's kind of where this card most shines. And that is neat, and you do feel really clever when you do it, but it was more work to trigger this than I kind of had anticipated. And it's really only an okay attack when you do so. The bottom of this card doing this like teleporting thing, again, in certain scenarios, this is just a cheat to win card. If you have, the right shadow in this certain spot, and lets your allies go from here to there. If it's a scenario where you really need to move, or one of these like escape from the falling ruin kind of scenarios, there aren't that many of them, but when there's something like that, this card can just absolutely shine. But most of the time, I don't think it's worth playing it as a lost card. So you've got this kind of conditional top with a conditional lost card on the bottom. Not as exciting as I wanted it to be. I thought the top was maybe going to be a little bit easier to deal with. So instead, I would recommend going the Restless Spirits path. Doing 3 attack and a curse is okay, but the fact that if you are, and it's a melee attack as well, but the fact that it can be a 6 attack if you're standing in the right position on one of your shadows, means that this card just has a much higher upside and at least a passable normal side on the top. The bottom's also kind of fun. Moving a shadow up to 4 hexes, like I said, I think moving 1 shadow many spaces is better than moving all your shadows a little bit of distance. So it kind of just gives you another option for doing that. But the fact that this also gives you the option of just yeeting that shadow into an enemy for 3 points of damage on a bottom allows you to actually play a little bit more versatility in those shadows. So I'd run Restless Spirits if I hit level 2 again at this class. I think both of the cards at level 3 are pretty respectable, and one is kind of the melee and one is kind of the ranged version, but I think that you can sort of take the one that just feels like where you want the gap. Like I said, I think probably the most fun I would have with this class is by playing a hybrid of melee and range. So I would look where I need to shore on my weaknesses and focus on that. So it kind of depends on what I took at second level and what kinds of cards I'm taking with me into the scenario. But let's start by talking about Deadbolt. Deadbolt's a totally respectable attack that lets you throw some curse on enemies. It's definitely a lot harder to come by curses in Frosthaven than it is otherwise. So if you're playing a party that cares about curses, Deadbolt might be a little bit more exciting. Moving all your shadows up to 3 hexes is a lot more mobility for your shadows than you really have otherwise. At the distance we're talking about here, you actually can sort of move your shadow army from one room into another. So I do think that that is a very nice option. I took Ritual Sacrifice because the idea, I did have some, I was playing in 4 players, so when I have like a Call to the Abyss, and there's some occasions where you have kind of a meat grinder, and Ritual Sacrifice could be, in theory, up to an attack 8. Yeah, but that never really happened. But it could be another attack 5, 6, 7. Basically, this is just another Strength of the Abyss in some ways. It's a little bit more niche than that, but also you can do it as an okay attack even early on in the scenario by throwing an Eclipse down in any situation, surrounding an enemy with it. You can get an attack 6 right off the bat, which is pretty good. 13 initiative, obviously really great too. And then the bottom of this is, it's not that common that you're going to eat some shadows so that you can throw a bunch of shields on people. But if you paid attention to my other guides, you might know that I was playing kind of like with a tank-based build, and so having the ability to eat some shadows, throw some shields on someone actually gave me some additional versatility. So Ritual Sacrifice was very, very good for me, even though I wasn't really playing primarily a melee build, because like I said, I think dancing between melee and range is a nice choice, and you can't go wrong with either card here. All right. I played Fleeting Dusk. I don't think I ever used the top ability. It's a much better version of the squiggly arms attack out of our shadow than the other ones, but it is a lost card. However, I took Fleeting Dusk for the bottom just to generate those additional shadows. I was already bumping into these problems of just needing more and more shadows, so being able to drop them in play made a big difference to me. So if you're finding that level of frustration, for me, that's the take. I wouldn't go back and change it. However, I do want to talk about how pulled across I think can be very good for this class. By focusing on the bottom, the move to and invisibility, if you really are focusing on that melee build, kind of gives you that strike from the shadows kind of thing. And this class is paper, right? So aside from your one kind of get out of jail teleport ability, you need ways to get out of enemies attack radii, even if you yourself are going to be in melee. So having the ability to move and go invisible is nice, especially if on the subsequent turn you're going to be long resting. Tacking an invisibility on a really bad initiative card like this means that you're going to want to pair it with something that does go really fast, I think most of the time, to get the maximum value out of it. The top of this, I'm pretty low on Bane and Frosthaven. I understand that they needed to move away from the auto kill things, but it waiting for a turn and every once in a while a stupid shaman like throwing a heal towards an enemy, it just doesn't. 10 points of damage is nice, but it requires 10 points of damage in the specific condition. It's a lost card. The enemy's going to get to attack again. It's fun to pull off, but I don't think that it does quite enough for me to think that it's worth it as a lost card. Level 5 is not one of these classes where it's like sort of a defining class structure. In fact, both of these cards are melee cards, so they're kind of going to push you in that certain direction. I took Dominate. The idea of 6 attack disarm was just too much to pass up on, and costs you one of your shadows. I guess technically you could argue this is ranged because you attack out of your shadows, so you could say the flexibility of that. But honestly, I played this card a lot just for the move 4 and the decent initiative at the bottom. So I'm mixed between those two for when it mattered or if I had the appropriate time to use the dark. It's a little funny to put a disarm on something that does so much damage because you're kind of just hoping to wipe that enemy straight out. But, there's plenty of guys in Frosthaven with just big, beefy hit points, and throw this on an Algox guard or whatever, and you're going to be pretty happy with that. So Dominate does nice work. Medium, on the other hand, which I did not get to play, attacks for a little bit less, and you still want that dark in order to attack for a little bit more. This leans more into the feast or famine side of this card. You want to be able to kill somebody. If you do kill them, wonderful, you get to get another shadow along the way. The nice thing about medium is that it actually allows you to get your shadow generation started and rolling. You don't need shadow generation to make this card good. And so one of the things that I think makes medium a little bit higher is if you have a way or a friend who generates dark that you can use, you could use this on turn 1 and maybe go later in the initiative, try to finish off an enemy that someone has softened up for you, get a shadow into play, and not have to use one of those lost cards to do it, which is pretty cool. The bottom of this card too is a interesting way of playing this class, allowing you to just constantly move your shadows with you. This fully fixes your mobility issues of having to dance between moving shadows and moving yourself, and then suddenly you can do all the things with this class. So I was appropriately lambasted on the Banner Spear video for being concerned about just the moves for the explosive epicenter, and I'm happy to walk back that mistake. And here I think I'm going to say that the bottom of this card I think is going to be very good for people who are playing a kind of Deathwalker that needs to be moving a fair amount, especially in the right scenarios where there's a fair amount of movement required, and keeping your shadows up with you. In a lot of ways, the level 6 cards are a little bit more how are you designing your class defining, I think, than the level 5 cards were. Vengeful Storm on the left, you get to gobble up shadows and pew, 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 shoot a whole bunch of people if you gobble them up. I generally didn't want to be gobbling them up that much because I already had, Strength of the Abyss and things like that wanted to use a whole bunch of shadows that were in play. But if you're finding yourself with over excess of shadow generation, you're amazing at generating shadows, this is a very fun way to just pincushion people as you're fighting. The problem that I found with this, or like with these kinds of abilities, is that you needed those shadows within range of yourself. So presumably you've been killing people, but if you've been killing people, then there aren't that many people left to target, and so the dream scenarios of Vengeful Storm are few and far between. I also, I'm not a big fan of lost cards. That being said, a lost card that can wound and stun multiple people around a circle. If you kill someone with your top ability, they turn into a shadow, and then every enemy within that, like surrounded by them, gets stunned, is actually pretty nasty. You also just can not use this for that ability, but speculating on playing this as a potential loss card, I think actually is pretty spicy. It's one of the losses that I'm a little bit more excited to play. That being said, I took Night Takes Shape. It's not often that I'm next to two shadows, but I like a big beefy minion, a big beefy resummonable minion that the enemies have disadvantage to attack it, so he's going to last for a little while. This was a lot of fun to put into play, and I did find myself in situations where I would kind of have wiped out a room of bad guys, and there's just a pile of shadows there, and I can't move all of them with me into the next room, so turning two of them into a shadow horror was pretty cool. Also, I think the art on that is absolutely rad, so that won my approval otherwise. The other thing I'll say is that the bottom of this card, while only really being okay, it's basically move somewhere and attack 3, is thematically just looks neat. When you play this card for the first time and you shove one of your shadows and you teleport to that spot and disappear and attack somebody, your friends are probably going to be like, what are you doing? So Night Takes Shape was a lot of fun, and for that reason alone, I would recommend taking it. Hachimachi. I wish I'd played level 7, because these are the most exciting level 7 cards I think I've seen on any class. You can notice that my enthusiasm for Deathwalker rises as the levels go up, and I think that's a reflection of what the cards are doing, because it's not just make shadows and then kind of pay off with the shadows. There's something a little bit more unique in the structure of the level ups. Let's talk about Proliferation of the Abyss, which is just kind of bizarre. First of all, if you have some night, you get to make another shadow, hooray. But then essentially for, as long as you want this ability to be going for, you can prevent damage with your shadows to you or allies. Only once. You'll discard this card after you do it, but it just kind of sits out there until you use it. It's that same sort of like teleport and prevent a hit thing that you had before, but you can use it for a friend as well. I think this is pretty nice. There's, by the time you're level 7, there's a lot of monsters in this game that being able to cancel their attacks is just pretty nice. I think Frosthaven, compared to other Haven, has a lot more kind of like walloping moments rather than death by 1,000 cuts moments. And in a 2-player game especially, I would be leaning towards doing Proliferation of the Abyss. This, again, kind of counters an enemy's turn at, the expense of your action, but you have a lot of flexibility with it, whereas your enemy is just kind of running on that robot mode, the AI, where sometimes they're going to whiff and sometimes they're going to hit, and you get to know when it matters most, and I think that's really, really significant here. The bottom here is also totally respectable, a move that moves your shadows. I say it's respectable, but I want to up my rating of that. I complained about the mobility issues with this class of being able to move while moving my shadows, and this card does both of those, and actually moves a fair amount, especially if you have that night to use as well. So I think Proliferation gives you a lot of options. I don't think I said proliferation right there. Hungry Gasps is thematically very fun. Again, sort of the horrible monsters coming out of the shadow thing. 2 attack 3s is fine for a level 7 card. It's okay. I don't think it's the most exciting, but it definitely hits hard enough to be fun, and the pulling is quite good in Frosthaven. Lots of classes care about that, so I think this one depends more on your friends than it does on anything else, really. The bottom of this card is hilarious. Generally, a lost heal is not something that people are doing, but you can generate upwards of 15 heal and 5 bless in the absolute perfect situations with Hungry Grasps, which is pretty funny. You can just pile them all on the same tanky level 7 person if they're really hurt and they're just surrounded by shadows somehow, and that's probably worth a lost card in there. Both of these level 7 cards are just rocking. But I think in 2-player, I'm definitely taking Proliferation. Hungry Grasps, it depends on my friends. I looked at these cards at first and I made a snap decision, and I'm pretty sure my snap decision is actually wrong. I'm going to start off by talking about Lashing Tendrils, which is the one I downplayed in my head. I read the top, I said it's a lost card with like conditional retaliate. Retaliate's kind of so-so in Haven games, but the more I thought about it, the more I actually really like this ability. You and your allies have a decent amount of control about when you end on shadows, and Persistent Retaliate 2 range 2 probably stacks up a fair amount of damage in the right scenario. If you were playing with someone in your party and the party happened to be someone who was like defensive and like hurt enemies for attacking them or anything like that, it might even be more exciting. So I think that Lashing Tendrils absolutely could work in the right group. But not to mention the bottom is pretty respectable. Moving 2 shadows up to 3 hexes. We've already seen a number of cards that move our shadows, so that's not the most exciting. But if you move them kind of in tandem with each other and surround an enemy with creepy shadows, they take 3 damage or 5 damage. 5 damage on the bottom of a card is a lot. So I think Lashing Tendrils is probably the choice that I would make at this level. Frozen in Fear is not going to be awesome all the time, but the times that it does hit, it's going to hit hard. Pin, immobilize to enemies that are surrounding a shadow is a variable use. Most of the time your shadows are going to be somewhere where enemies are already in melee, but if you have a situation where you do have some enemies that are not in melee, but they are melee monsters, and you're able to pin them, like you could have multiple people essentially miss their turns with this immobilize ability. Throw a little damage on them as well. Hooray. I just think that most of the time the setup for this is gonna not work out as well as you want it to. So the times that it works, it's going to be a huge game changer, but I think a lot of times it's just going to be fine. And then the bottom of this card is a loss. So with a top that I think requires conditional situations and a bottom that's a loss card, I would be leaning towards taking the Lashing Tendrils instead. But it's worth noting that the bottom of this card is sort of like it's basically like another Eclipse, right? Puts 2 and sends them out shooting in various directions. So another ability to just sort of cash out. I think this class has a lot of like cash out either in the beginning or at the end, losses to like throw out shadows and start going crazy, which is, I mean, it's basically the structure of how it goes. Level 9 has a card that's hilarious and a card that's hilarious. When your time comes is the sort of, if you ever played the old Diablo, the Necromancer, the body bomb thing or whatever, you choose somebody and then when they die, they explode and do damage to people. I think traditionally in the Haven games, these effects have not been as powerful as they seem. They just seem more fun than anything else. I do really appreciate that they tack on an attack here as well. And it doesn't dictate that you have to attack the same person. It's a separate attack. You might want to soften them up, or you might explicitly not. Or frankly, you can kill them with the attack. It's only an attack 2, but maybe you can finish them off so they explode. Unfortunately, if you do, you don't get the curse on them, which is a little goofy, but that's a really fun ability. I don't think that it's amazing, and I probably am going to end up choosing Black Lance here, but I do dig the theming of it a fair amount. The bottom here is another way to generate shadows, but you need to have enemies dying and you need to have dark in order to do it. I don't think you're going to be generating dark quite enough for this to, it's not like you're going to be playing multiple per turn. I don't know that I want to be using a level 9 lost card as just sort of like a generation of shadows. That's what my dumb level 1 lost card is for. So it gets a lot more shadows in play quicker. But I think if I'm taking When Your Time Comes, it's because I'm planning on playing the top kind of repeatedly. Black Lands, on the other hand, is an awesome payoff card. You get to charge through a couple shadows, and then for every shadow, you can stab someone for a bunch of damage. Doing something like 10 or whatever attack is just absolutely hilarious if you have the setup for it. I also just love the theme of running through the shadows and making this gigantic long shadow spear. So theme alone wins me on Black Lance. And the bottom of the card is okay too. It feels like one of those cards that was designed for Mind Thief back in Gloomhaven, but they probably gave it to Mind Thief at level 1, so it's only appropriate for it to be a level 9 card. for any Frosthaven character, which is fair. Generates some dark, pretty fast initiative. Black Lance, I think, is pretty flexible, both top and bottom, in a way that makes it really hard for me to say no to that card. All right, let's talk masteries. This top one removes 7 shadow in 1 round. I spent only about 45 seconds trying to figure out how to do it, and I couldn't do it, and I gave up. I'm pretty sure it requires you to have a card that removes a bunch of shadows in 1 turn, so you get rid of 5 of them. A ongoing ability that lets you remove a shadow. Maybe you're like block and teleport to a shadow. That's 6, but you also needed to generate a new one with your super attack. And then there's some other way to get a 7th, probably with a similar type of thing. That seems like a lot of work. And I mean, it's a mastery, that's fair, but it also seems like you need the right cards to make it work. So maybe I missed it that you actually can do it with sort of the base level 1 cards, but I actually think that you need some like a specific group of cards in order to make this work. On the other hand, the bottom one I think is definitely pretty doable. Placing or removing at least 1 shadow each round is very in your wheelhouse. You probably are starting with something like one of the abilities that just generates these over the course of the game. It's probably easier in a 4-player game if you've got like Call to the Abyss up and your friends are helping you to do this. So the bottom mastery requires persistence and dedication. You're also probably hoping for a shorter round. This is going to be easier in one of those King of the Hill scenarios where enemies are constantly spawning and coming at you. You don't have to move to them to ensure that you are either making more shadows or cashing them out to make attacks every turn. So I think in the right scenario, especially those small room scenarios, small single room type of places, you're gonna be able to pull off the second mastery a lot more easily. For the most part, the perks are some of the more boring perks, honestly, that I've seen in Frosthaven. That doesn't mean bad. In fact, it kind of means the opposite, because you just make a pretty good attack deck, and this class is constantly attacking, so having a good attack modifier deck, well worth your time. Just removing some negatives along the way, making that better, always good. If you played the original Haven games, they don't have a structure like this for most of the characters, so this is just straight improving your deck, and you could play this class just straight improving your deck and be pretty happy with it. Toying around with random curse cards is nice and fun, but I don't like when my attack modifier deck has a random curse card in it because I end up killing enemies and then they end up not getting cursed anyway. Generating additional dark is great if you are taking cards that want that dark thing. It's nice to just incidentally have that and you're like, ooh, now I can play this card this turn if I want to. I was going to play it later, but I have the option to play it now, and that's pretty sweet. I do really actually quite like a muddle and disarm rolling modifier, so I think these are fun to put in there. I talked in another class about how much I think healing allies and a rolling modifier is actually quite good. This is a nice way to just throw off random wounds and poisons. I don't know why this is on this class in particular, but I would happily throw this in a deck if I'm helping people out. I probably would focus mostly on the attacking side, but this is worth, I think, putting there somewhere in the middle. I'm not generally a big fan of the ignore scenario effects perks myself. Obviously, there are lots of scenarios where bad things happen. It's a chilly place, this Frosthaven. Lots of annoying things that happen that way, but I'm a little bit more come see, come saw, and I'd rather make myself by default look awesome. I don't like when it doesn't do anything in a scenario, but maybe you just like it. Good for you. So whenever you long rest, you can move 1 shadow up to 3 hexes. I was not a big fan of because this class can get away with short resting a fair amount, and oftentimes I did, so having this be sort of wasted just felt really unfortunate. But I did complain about how hard it was to move shadows, so pairing it with a long rest is pretty respectable if you're feeling that frustration. I don't recommend taking both of these. It feels like you're just kind of competing with yourself for what sort of rest you're taking. And I don't generally love these short rests eat a element ones that there are on a lot of the classes, but this is a pretty nice one. A muddle and a curse, they go hand in hand with each other. And you actually have probably decent range with it from where your shadow is. And if you're short resting, there's a good chance you're in conflict already. So I like this one more than I like a bunch of the other ones. But we've gotten to the one that I think is really the most important. This is the one that I think makes the melee build viable and is just frankly really good, even if you're not the melee build. Making it so that enemies have disadvantage while attacking you for a shadow with just 1 tick mark. I think this is one that you should be picking up early. even if you're not going to be getting into the mix that much. Like I said, I do recommend doing sort of like a hybrid of the melee and the ranged while playing this class. I think it's probably the most fun way to play it and give yourself that flexibility of what you're going to do with those shadows along the way. That's going to bring us to the end of the Deathwalker. I'm sure that part of my experience is colored by the fact that maybe I wasn't very good at playing it. I also felt like this class was good. It's just I didn't like that it was either really bad or either like very, very good. It just didn't feel consistent, and that lack of consistency I found to be frustrating rather than fun when it was successful. When it was successful, it felt like the class was working correctly, and I had spent the time sort of like making the shadows, using the lost cards, having those turns where I'm not doing quite as much in order to have the turns where I'm getting paid off. In a lot of ways, play flow felt like the drifter for me, right? Where it's like you're setting something up, but in this case it's shadows rather than managing those little tracks, and then kind of cashing out to play those along the way. But there was something about managing the movement of these pieces throughout that just it felt more taxing rather than successful in a lot of instances. And it's a shame because there are a lot of really cool thematic cards in this class. It just didn't land with me as well as it did with hopefully some of you. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching this video. This brings me to the end of my 4 class sessions. So I'm going to have to do something like this again so I can get acquainted with the other classes and make some more videos along the way. But it's been really fun to take the winter break to return to Frosthaven. Hope you enjoyed these videos. If in case you haven't already, throw me a like and subscribe. I'd appreciate that. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Ciao.